Welcome to Life Stories. What happens when a powerful, wealthy woman makes a reckless bet that changes her life forever? Sophia Reynolds, a billionaire businesswoman, believes she can control everything, even love. But when she marries Ryan Carter, a humble mechanic, just to win a bet, she never expects her world to unravel. As their two worlds collide, she is forced to confront what truly matters: power, control, or something far more real. Will Sophia lose everything, or will she discover a life she never knew she needed? Subscribe to our channel to begin today's story. If you had asked me back then if I believed in fate, I would have laughed. My life was built on structure, on control, on knowing the next step before I even took it. There was no room for randomness, no space for surprises. Everything about me, my career, my relationships, my public image, was a carefully curated masterpiece. And yet, in one reckless moment, a single wager set my entire world spiraling into something I could have never foreseen. It began at a charity gala, the kind of event I had attended hundreds of times before. The ballroom was an ocean of wealth, of soft laughter and clinking champagne glasses, of carefully practiced smiles and whispered business deals sealed between sips of vintage wine. I moved through the crowd effortlessly, as I always did, nodding at familiar faces, exchanging pleasantries with men in sharp tuxedos and women in designer gowns. This was my world, and I was its queen. Then I saw my brother, Ethan, leaning against the marble bar with that ever-present air of amusement. Unlike me, Ethan had never felt the need to prove himself. He enjoyed our family's wealth without the burden of responsibility. Where I saw an empire to build, he saw a playground. You always look like you're plotting world domination, he mused as I approached. I smirked, taking a sip of my drink. And you always look like you're about to say something ridiculous. He chuckled, swirling his whiskey lazily before tilting his head at me. Tell me something, Sophia. Don't you ever get tired of all this? I raised an eyebrow. This? The parties, the people, the endless cycle of being perfect. Perfection is why I'm successful, Ethan. He shrugged. Sure, but it's also why you're predictable. I let out a soft laugh, shaking my head. You think I'm predictable? I know you are, he said smugly. Everything about your life is curated. Your business, your relationships, even your friends. Everything and everyone fits into your world perfectly. I rolled my eyes. And, he continued, his grin widening. I don't think you could handle something truly unpredictable. Something, or someone, who doesn't fit into your perfectly controlled reality. His words should have bounced off me. I had spent my entire life dismissing opinions that questioned my choices. But something about the way he said it, the absolute certainty in his voice, irritated me. What exactly are you suggesting? A bet. That caught my attention. I had always been competitive, had always needed to win, to prove myself superior. It had been that way since we were children. And Ethan knew it. I bet, he said, that you can't marry someone completely outside of your world and make it last 6 months. I narrowed my eyes. Marry? Not just date, not just a fling. A real marriage. No loopholes, no easy outs. Someone who doesn't belong here. Someone you'd never even glance at. I studied him carefully. And what do I get if I win? Ethan leaned in, lowering his voice. The controlling shares of Reynolds Enterprises. His words sent a thrill through me. Our father had built the company. But since retiring, he had left final control split between us. I ran the business. But Ethan held enough power to block my decisions when it suited him. If I won, I would have complete autonomy. And if I lose? I asked. You admit I was right, he said, smirking. You admit that you can't adapt to something you can't control. I scoffed. That's it? You want a confession? From you? He chuckled. That's worth more than money. The idea was absurd, but that only made it more enticing. A challenge, a game, and I never lost. Fine, I said, extending my hand. You have a deal. Ethan shook it, grinning. This is going to be fun. As I sipped my champagne, my mind was already racing. I would need to find someone completely opposite to my world. Someone who met the conditions of the bet but was manageable enough that I could control the situation. It was only 6 months. How difficult could it be? The next morning, I sat in my private study, a cup of black coffee in hand, flipping through a list of names my assistant had prepared. Sophia had followed my instructions precisely. The candidates included struggling artists, cab drivers, school teachers, and even a street musician. Each one was ordinary, unpolished, and completely unsuited for my elite social circle. But none of them intrigued me. They were too meek, too desperate. I needed someone I could control, but not someone who would become dependent on me. The arrangement had to be clean, free of emotional complications, a contract rather than a relationship. Frustration set in as I flipped through profile after profile, each one more uninspiring than the last. Just as I was about to toss the folder aside, a name caught my eye. Ryan Carter, a 42-year-old mechanic who ran a small auto shop in Detroit. No elite education, no trust fund, no powerful connections. A man who worked with his hands, whose daily life was as far removed from mine as possible. I read through the report. He was large, over 6 feet tall and broad-shouldered, but more than that. He was heavy-set, something that would immediately set him apart in my world where thinness and refinement were currency. He was known in his neighborhood for his generosity, often fixing cars for struggling families at reduced prices or for free. More interestingly, he was deeply involved with a local shelter, dedicating his free time to helping the homeless. But what stood out most was that he wasn't desperate. He had his own life, his own beliefs, and he wasn't looking for a handout. That, I decided, made him the perfect choice. Within an hour, my assistant had arranged a meeting. I wouldn't approach him as a woman looking for a husband, that would be ridiculous. Instead, I would frame it as a business proposition, something mutually beneficial. If there was one thing I understood, it was how to make an offer impossible to refuse. The moment I stepped out of my car in front of Ryan Carter's garage, I knew I was completely out of place. The scent of oil and metal clung to the air, a stark contrast to the carefully curated world I had just left behind. My heels clicked against the cracked pavement, each step feeling more absurd than the last. Grease-stained rags lay tossed over metal workbenches. Old tires stacked haphazardly against the walls. The open bay doors revealed a man bent over the hood of an old sedan, his hands covered in oil as he worked with quiet efficiency. I cleared my throat. "I'm looking for Ryan Carter." He didn't even glance up. "You lost?" His tone was rough, dismissive. I wasn't used to that. People didn't speak to me like that. I squared my shoulders and stepped closer. "No, I'm exactly where I need to be." That got his attention. He straightened, wiping his hands on a rag before finally looking at me. His dark brown eyes held a mix of curiosity and skepticism. Up close, he was even bigger than I expected, broad shoulders, thick arms, the kind of strength that came from real labor, not personal trainers and gym memberships. "You're Ryan Carter?" "Yeah, who's asking?" I extended my hand. "Sophia Reynolds." He didn't take it. Instead, he crossed his arms, leaning back against the car. "Reynolds as in Reynolds Enterprises?" So, he knew who I was. That made things easier. "Yes." His gaze didn't change. He was studying me, trying to figure out what someone like me wanted in a place like this. And what does a billionaire hotel heiress want with a guy who changes brake pads for a living? Straight to the point. I appreciated that. "I have a proposal for you," I said, keeping my voice steady, one that could be beneficial to both of us. He raised an eyebrow but didn't interrupt. "I know you volunteer at the St. Mark's shelter," I continued. "I also know that the funding is unstable and that you've been covering a lot of costs out of your own pocket." His jaw tensed slightly. "Where are you going with this?" "I want to offer you financial support for the shelter. Enough to keep it running for years." I held his gaze. "In exchange, I need something from you." His skepticism deepened. "And what exactly would that be?" I took a breath. "A marriage." Silence. The sounds of the garage, tools clanking, a radio playing softly in the background, filled the space between us. Then he laughed. A deep, genuine laugh, as if I had just told the most ridiculous joke he'd ever heard. "That's funny," he said, shaking his head. "Really? But seriously, what do you actually want?" I didn't flinch. "I'm not joking. His laughter faded. He studied me, his expression unreadable. You want me to marry you? A woman I've never met? Yes. For what? That's not relevant, I said coolly. What matters is that it's temporary. 6 months. You don't have to change your life. And you'll be well compensated. He exhaled, running a hand over his face. This is insane. And yet, you're considering it. He sighed, shaking his head. I don't trust you. You don't have to, I countered. I'm not asking you to believe in me. I'm asking you to believe in what this money could do for the people you help. That struck a nerve. I could see it in the way his posture shifted, in the flicker of emotion that passed through his eyes. He cared, deeply. Still, he didn't answer right away. He was watching me, trying to gauge whether I was serious or if this was some elaborate joke. I held his gaze, refusing to waver. Finally, he exhaled. I'll think about it. I handed him my business card. You have 24 hours. Ryan took the card but didn't look at it. He was still watching me, as if trying to decipher what kind of person would make such an outrageous proposal. As I turned to leave, I knew I had already won. Because people like Ryan, people who spent their lives giving to others, could never walk away from the chance to do more. He didn't need to like me. He just needed to say yes. Ryan Carter had spent the past 24 hours grappling with the most ridiculous proposal he had ever received. Marriage? To Sophia Reynolds? A billionaire hotel heiress with the composure of a queen in the presence of an avalanche? It was absurd on every conceivable level. And yet, here he was, standing in front of the glass-covered high-rise that housed her Chicago penthouse. Suitcase in hand, wondering if he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. He hadn't said yes lightly. When she had walked out of his garage, her high heels clicking against the pavement like punctuation marks in an unreadable sentence, Ryan had been convinced he would say no. He didn't need her money. He didn't want to be tangled in some rich woman's game. But then, he thought of the St. Mark's shelter. He thought of the families who came in seeking warmth during brutal Midwest winters. The kids who clung to their mothers because they had nowhere else to go. He thought of the food shortages. The nights when he had to turn people away because there simply weren't enough beds. And he thought about how much of his own savings had gone into keeping the place running. Her offer had been manipulative. Sure, but she hadn't been wrong. He did care, and if 6 months of his life could ensure that the people he fought for had security, then what choice did he really have? So, against all logic, he had agreed. Now, as he stood outside her penthouse building, staring up at the impossibly sleek structure, he felt like a complete fraud. He didn't belong here. He wasn't sure he even wanted to belong here. But he had made a deal. And he was a man who honored his word. The doorman, a stiff-looking man in a perfectly pressed suit, regarded Ryan with barely concealed skepticism as he stepped inside. Can I help you, sir? Ryan exhaled, gripping the handle of his suitcase a little tighter. Yeah, I'm here for Sophia Reynolds. The doorman blinked, visibly struggling to reconcile the rugged, broad-shouldered mechanic in a worn-out jacket with the pristine world of Sophia Reynolds. After a brief hesitation, he stepped aside and gestured toward the elevator. Penthouse level, sir. Ryan nodded, stepping into the elevator, feeling distinctly like he was being sucked into another universe. When the doors slid open, the penthouse was exactly what he had expected, towering glass windows that stretched from floor to ceiling, offering a breathtaking view of the Chicago skyline. The place was all sleek surfaces, minimalist decor, and an eerie sort of perfection that made him feel even more out of place. Sophia was already waiting for him. She stood near the large marble kitchen island, arms crossed, dressed in a crisp white blouse and tailored black pants. Her blonde hair swept into an effortless updo. She didn't look surprised to see him. If anything, she looked satisfied. You're late, she said. Ryan raised an eyebrow. Wasn't aware we set a time. She simply tilted her head toward a side hallway. Your room is down that way. The guest suite. So they weren't even pretending to share a bedroom. Good. At least that meant she had no intention of playing house. He set his suitcase down and took a slow look around. Nice place. It serves its purpose, she replied coolly. I assume you don't need a tour? Not unless you're worried I'll get lost. That earned him a faint smirk before she gestured toward the kitchen. I have rules. A lot of them. We will attend functions together when necessary. You will dress appropriately. You will not embarrass me in front of my associates. And this arrangement is strictly professional. Understood? Ryan took a beat before answering. Got it. Now, do I get to set any rules? Or is this a dictatorship? She didn't seem amused. Your job is to stay out of my way. Do that, and we'll get through these 6 months just fine. Ryan wasn't sure why he had expected anything different. But what neither of them knew then was that neither of them would make it through this deal unchanged. The first morning in Sophia Reynolds' penthouse was the moment Ryan Carter realized just how different their worlds were. He woke up early, out of habit more than anything. Years of running an auto shop had trained his body to rise with the sun. No matter how late he had gone to bed, the penthouse was eerily silent as he padded barefoot into the massive kitchen, taking in its gleaming appliances and marble countertops that looked like they had never been touched. The fridge was stocked, but not with anything he recognized as real food. Organic greens, imported cheeses, bottles of green juice labeled with ingredients he couldn't even pronounce. Ryan exhaled and started searching the cabinets until he found eggs and bacon, hidden behind rows of pre-packaged health food. 10 minutes later, the scent of sizzling bacon filled the kitchen, thick and unapologetically greasy. He had just plated his food when he heard the sharp click of heels against the hardwood floor. Sophia stopped dead in her tracks. Her gaze locked onto the plate in front of him like it had personally offended her. What is that? Ryan glanced down at his breakfast. Food. She inhaled slowly, as if trying to compose herself. You're going to make the entire place smell like grease. That's kind of how cooking works. Her lips pressed together into a thin line. We have a chef for a reason. Yeah, well, I'm not really the tiny gourmet portion type, Ryan said, taking a bite of his bacon. I like real food. Then don't burn my kitchen down in the process. He smirked, chewing slowly. Your kitchen, huh? You even use it? Her eyes narrowed. I don't have time to cook. Figures. He gestured toward the fridge. You know, half of that stuff in there isn't even food. It's a science experiment waiting to happen. Sophia didn't dignify that with a response. Instead, she grabbed a green juice and took a measured sip, eyes still locked on him like he was a wild animal loose in her palace. From there, things only escalated. She dragged him to a high-end tailor later that afternoon, where he stood stiffly as measurements were taken, feeling like a mannequin as they dressed him in a 3-piece suit that probably cost more than his entire apartment. In retaliation, Ryan took her to a small diner in downtown Chicago, just to see how she would handle it. Sophia stared at the laminated menu like it might bite her. She skimmed over the burgers, the milkshakes, the fried everything, then carefully ordered a black coffee, her tone suggesting she was deeply offended by the entire experience. At social events, she led him through rooms of Manhattan's elite, introducing him with smooth, calculated charm, while he struggled not to laugh at the sheer ridiculousness of it all. They were oil and water. But what surprised Ryan the most wasn't how different they were. It was how unshakable Sophia was in her belief that she could control everything. Even him. And maybe, for the first time, she had met someone who wouldn't be controlled. The silence in the penthouse was suffocating. It had been days since Ryan Carter walked out, but his absence lingered like a weight Sophia Reynolds couldn't shake. She had spent her entire life believing that winning was everything, that control was the key to success. But now, for the first time, she wasn't sure if winning was worth what she had lost. She had tried to move on the way she always did, by throwing herself into work, surrounding herself with luxury, with power, but none of it filled the space he had left behind. And then, one evening, she did something she never thought she would do. She went back to the shelter. Not as a benefactor, not as a businesswoman, but as someone trying to understand. She spent hours listening, working, learning. She didn't do it for Ryan. She did it because, for the first time, she wanted to. When she finally saw him again, standing outside the garage, she felt something she hadn't felt in years, uncertainty. Ryan looked at her, arms crossed, waiting. She exhaled. I was wrong. He raised an eyebrow. About what? About everything. A long silence stretched between them. And then, finally, Ryan nodded. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But it was a beginning. And for the first time in her life, Sophia Reynolds was okay with not having all the answers. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss our next ones. Check out our other videos for more captivating life stories. And don't forget to share this video with your friends. See you in the next one.